You can ask questions, and after the panel, of course, also to Anne, just to confirm, because in all the meetings and all the discussions I attended in the US and even in Austria the last year, the keywords were confidence and trust by the great businesses and everybody, and of course privacy. But it was extremely difficult still to connect those three keywords and then to see it as a positive sum. Before moving on to the next panel, just wanted to invite you still to download our grip app, our connection app, our Tinder, in a way for the ARIT, to get connected with each other. We would try to avoid, color codes on your badges, and you have to run around with the lists, which color means what. So if you go to Tinder, download it in your Play Store or iTunes Store, and then you can connect with everybody here you still haven't met. Maybe you did already meet everybody, but go to grip, and then you will see who is doing what and where he comes from. We move on to the next panel, and I'm pleased to introduce Christoph Becker to you, our moderator of the panel. Christoph is an expert in digital data curation at the University here of Toronto, and our moderator for this panel. Christoph, thank you.
Thank you. And I think it's time to invite all the panelists as well to join us all on stage. Thank you. So maybe I'll stay for a moment. So good morning again, and so essentially as you see, the title of our panel suggests that we want to look at how big data is moving in considerations also from the technology, from engineering and sciences into other fields such as the humanities. And so, of course, big data is often seen as a very fuzzy term, very often seen as data that is complex, unstructured, but those definitions are not necessarily what matter most to us in this panel. But one thing that does matter and that is very interesting, and it was very interesting to see this, I think, in this wonderful talks that we just heard, is how data is relevant now in disciplines that haven't even dreamt of it before. And I would just like to add one example to the set of stories that we heard, and that is, for example, history. History used to be defined as a discipline of scarcity, where you could almost not find any data to look at. If something was found in the archive, you could essentially write a story about it, publish a paper about it, because by virtue of being in the archive, it was relevant. Somebody made a selection, somebody made a choice, somebody threw away, the archivist threw away something else, and by virtue of surviving over time, the document was of value. And so now, if you're a historian and you study, for example, social life in the 80s, social life in the 90s, could you do that without the web, without looking at the social web of the 90s, for example? Many historians nowadays start to agree that no, you can't. But the content in a web archive was not created by a web archivist. There was no archivist involved in the creation of the web archive. The selection process was primarily technical, and there is an abundance of material. There is not one document that you can pick. How do you read 12 million web pages and still find the single story that you want to look at, that you want to read as a humanist? How do you tell that story still? Well, you use big data computing technology, but that technology wasn't developed for history, it was developed for sciences, it was developed for engineering. And how do you do that? And I have the pleasure of working with some of the first historians who are doing this. And how do they do that? They collaborate with some of the leading figures in big data to analyze the enormous amounts that you find in web archive material using big data computing, using visualization to tell stories about history that is recent history. And so how do they do that? They learn about technology, and the big data computing researchers learn to see that technology in a different angle. And so just to add that story to that. And so you already met Cavoukian and Katja Schechtner. They're joined on stage by Wolfgang Gatterbauer and Christina Binz-Scharf. Christina Binz-Sharf is Associate Professor of Management at the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership at the City College of the University of New York, where she teaches courses in organizational behavior, social entrepreneurship, and information technology and management. Her research examines how individuals search for and share knowledge through networks in order to accomplish work. And as she told us yesterday, she's currently writing a book about the future of work, which sounds very easy to write. So her research is funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health, US Department of Education, and others. And I found interesting that she has a PhD in business economics, but a Bachelor of Art. And then Wolfgang Gatterbauer, assistant professor in the Tepper School of Business and the Computer Science Department at Carnegie Mellon University. His research focuses on scalable approaches to performing inference over uncertain data. It's supported by a career award from the National Science Foundation in the US. And before that, he was a postdoc in the database group at the University of Washington, but also a medal winner at the Physics Olympiad, and he worked in engineering and consulting in industry before. Myself, I'm at the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto, and I'm also still a senior scientist at the Vienna University of Technology in Vienna, where I got my education and professional experience in software engineering, business informatics, computer science, but worked for my PhD on supporting cultural heritage organizations in Europe in decision-making about the preservation of the large-scale big data collections that they hold. And that is what brought me into more of the interdisciplinary fields around information where I'm now, where I spent most of my time in an environment where a third of the faculty members have a PhD in computer science, a third in humanities, and roughly a third in social sciences. And so my own PhD students tell me about their fields such as architecture and design and philosophy where they have their graduate degrees, and it's a truly exhilarating experience, I have to say. And so my own research focuses on longer-term perspectives in software systems design and in how the design process of technologies, software systems technologies especially, influences longer-term outcomes. And one of the fields in which I do that is digital curation, which is essentially the management and preservation of digital resources, digital data, for future use. And so future use starts tomorrow and might last for a very long time. In this capacity, one very interesting thing is to have seen the emergence of data-intensive research in different disciplines and to have seen how differently it emerges at different times in very different forms in those different disciplines. And even what is data is not an obvious question. Almost everything can be data to someone, and we've seen a few examples already of very, very different kinds of data that become data for something else from some other perspective, and I look forward to seeing some more of that. And so we had a few preliminary discussions about this, of course, our essentially one of the guiding questions we want to ask is how do those different perspectives around the different disciplines in our background interact in work with data in the research of the panel members, but also in your research. And that's something that we mean very seriously. We actually basically did not prepare the full panel. We wanted to make sure that we prepare the panel in a way that we get your perspectives and your questions involved. So we really want your input in that, especially in the second half or after an initial round. So how will this go? Essentially, we will start with impulse statements by Wolfgang and Maria, starting with Wolfgang, and then moving on to Maria. And between those, we'll have some time for reactions, for questions. After the initial round, we really want to encourage you all to add your voices. Very literally, we'll have microphones, and there is, I believe there was a standing microphone, yes, in the middle here, but there will also be running microphones. So we'll keep an eye on you. And we'll nudge you a little bit again and try to keep track as best as I can with my limited abilities. And with that, I'll hand over to Wolfgang.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yep. So thank you. Thank Clemens and team for having me here. So I want to shortly talk about 4 points. What is big data? A couple of examples of usage of big data. What does it take to do some work in big data? And some parallels of big data. So what is big data? The word is not a very well chosen word because we all think about big data. We really need a large amounts of data. But actually, there's a confluence of a couple of emergent phenomena that we have. And let me give you more like examples. How many of you are having today wearing a watch on your armrest? How many of you are having a mobile phone or an iPad or something like this close to you or on you today? So you see, I think it's like a little bit more the second thing. So these instruments are very, very, very effective tools that allow us to have different kind of applications that people haven't thought before. For example, the application you used before that mentioned, Clemens, CRIT, these tools. What is the idea? Where you can type in your preferences and then allows you to find people with similar preferences. It turns out many people in America, Austria is unpopular, find their mates for life in this kind of online social networks. And it's a very straightforward idea. You type in some kind of preferences, what you like, and in America you have a very big division. Those people who believe in evolution, those who don't. Also on the political spectrum, if you go out and meet somebody, you don't talk about this because it's something you avoid, for example. Here you see certain things. So it allows people to actually be meshed together. Another example, before when we thought about this panel, we thought about the idea, maybe we should post here some kind of a Google URL, platform, web address, so people, when you have questions or comments, you can type it in, it shows up then on one of our screens, and we can respond to this. This is another example. Another example is, how many of you are using Fitbit or something like this, or an from Apple, something like this? So these numbers will considerably increase over the next 10 years. What is the idea? Now, all of a sudden, you can do something, you can track something. In America, many people suffer from obesity. Yeah, you have heard this. But how do you track this? If you have certain devices that actually track what you're doing, how many steps you go, it's a very different effect of seeing what you're doing, if you're doing something towards your goal. Another example. One of the biggest problems with older people today of using medicine is they don't use the medicine. They forget about this. It's very hard to us understand, but if you look at, if you have relatives who are older, it's not that trivial to see every day you take a red pill, a yellow pill, something that maybe in the words culturally difficult for a doctor to understand, that old people actually have a really hard time with this. So it's kind of one of the biggest problems is people don't use it. Very simple idea, glow cap. What is this? A small cap. Every time people take the medicine, it glows. If they don't take the medicine, it will glow and rattle until they take the medicine. So all of a sudden, it's not about getting better medicine, but taking people to use this medicine. So very simple ideas like this can actually do this. Now the second thing that has happened is, not just individually, but now you can track compliance. A doctor can see from many different people, are they actually using the medicine? And those people who don't use it, or it does not work. Because before, a doctor doesn't know. The people come, yes, I take my medicine. Did you really? People don't know it. So all of a sudden, this data that comes together can be aggregated and can make better use for other people. How many use Google Maps, for example, or something like this? Have you ever observed that you type in, you want to go somewhere, and it says, there's a traffic jam ahead? Yeah? How does it do this? So imagine the following is that all of us, we're driving on the same route, just a couple of kilometers before us. And we notice Anne is very slow at a certain point. Why? Because these devices track you. Yeah? Later Maria comes and I come, and all of this is slow. So that means if you come, Google knows, oh, there must be a traffic jam. And it can incorporate this and say, we route you somewhere else. Yeah? So this means now you have all these sensors. So one of the things that led to this kind of phenomenon is that we now have far more sensors that track some information that's useful for yourself, even if it's not big data, but it just tracks something. But also if you aggregate this, you can get all kind of different informations. And the interesting thing is now that these kind of phenomena, the data is useful, is now an emerger, it becomes in the mindset of people even outside of the hard disciplines, outside of those disciplines that have used data for all the time. So all of a sudden, you can come in areas which are protected from a data-driven decision-making. You have hunches. What do we think? We think something like this. And this is something, it's not a completely new idea. If you think about back, people who had better data, if you go back to the Babylonians, astronomy and can predict when will the rain fall. Science is basically, you have some data, you see some stars, and then what makes more sense? Is the sun going around the Earth or vice versa? Just now we have different types of data. Yeah? Let me give you 3 examples. Stefano Ehrmann is a new assistant professor at Stanford. He works on probabilistic inference, reasoning. Actually, before this, let me say 2 more things. Then 2 more things about big data. Then there was an observation in the last couple of years that has shown that if you use more data to train simple algorithms, then these algorithms actually perform better then more sophisticated algorithms on smaller data. So people have this used, I've cited in the blog post a very early example from Microsoft. You train natural language translation systems. You take 100,000, 10,000, millions, billions of sentences, and all of a sudden this stuff still increases. It gets better and better. Another emerging phenomenon, the last couple of years, and you may have heard about this, really breakthrough, deep learning, deep networks. So it turns out we have now certain tools and machines, GPUs, those efficient processors that are used in the computers to render your screens and computer games. They are very useful for different type of problems, training this kind of deep networks. And it turns out if you give really, really a large amount of data to these tools, they perform really, really well. And this was, for example, the breakthrough. Some of you may have heard about Go. The first human champion have been beaten by a computer program in Go. And this happened 10 years before it was predicted a couple of years. And why is this? So let me give you, chess. Chess is pretty simple. If you're playing chess against each other, and I look at the board, you have the queen, I've lost it, and we are comparable, that's probably bad for me. So it's easy to justify, if you look at the board, what's the current status. Go is far more difficult. In Go, you look at the state, and it's not clear at the end. Many things happen at the very end of this game. And that's the reason why you have a far bigger space to explore this. It's very hard to justify its state. It was a big problem for computers to beat in Go. Now, with these deep networks, people have taught this system by looking at many, many different past games, try to learn a function that evaluates how good is a particular system. And then you can take this with this exploitative power, and then we have something which people didn't predict a couple of years ago would happen so early. So we have these kind of deep belief networks, and they are beating all kind of different benchmarks in translation theory. Amazon Echo understands what you're running, and this is changing a number of things. Let me give you now some examples about this deep network. So Stefano Erman from Stanford. One problem with poverty research in Africa, for example, is it's very hard to get data and say, how does the economic development in certain areas progress? Because you have all kind of a service. And there's not enough to get this. So what they figured out is some way to use satellite images. We have always, all the time around us, satellites circling around us. They take images in all kind of different resolutions, all different wavelengths from the planet. They have learned some system with deep belief networks that can very well calculate the economic development and say how well has it progressed over time. This sounds simple, but actually, in order to do this, they have developed some technical problems. We got a science paper just, and last week we had at Carnegie Mellon the New Frontiers, what is called New Frontiers, a meeting from Obama was there, and a couple of people presented this, so he presented this kind of work. Yeah? So by solving this kind of problem, they were able also to solve something else. The second example is a little bit similar to Katja's example, but the positive side, where traffic has actually worked. In Pittsburgh, we have a very innovative major who allows us to test all kind of different systems in the city. So Professor Smith from Carnegie Mellon, he has also looked at traffic jams. And what they've come up with is a system that allows you to track what is the current flow and then automatically change the red and the green lights. They don't use heavy sensors, digging up. We didn't have to any digs of these ones. They use very simple radar locations, very cheap to do. And the important thing, the innovation was in a decentralized way. So this means the different traffic lengths. See, nobody's coming there, but I know somebody's coming there, so maybe I should put it into the green. And while this person drives through and sends off, it sends to the one left. One here is, hey, I'm sending you 2 down. And the sensor there says, yeah, but 5 come from the other side. So this system, a decentralized way, optimizes the traffic flow. And we have a reduction of traffic in the area where it's deployed by 25% of time it takes. And like in any normal systems engineering, it was not rolled out over the whole of Pittsburgh, but that's basic principles. You roll it out in a small part of the city. And you test it. And you look at the data. Do you have big cars or do you have motorcyclists? Yeah. So I would say the failure is, for me, not a failure of culture and understanding, but of engineering. You don't roll out a big system that's made for big cars in an area where the data shows there are not many big cars. The other example, which is closer to my research, Chris Ray, he works on also probabilistic inference. How can you extract a large amounts of information from the web and make this available to people. He has solved a problem of human trafficking. It turns out these people, it's hard to believe, but it happens. Many people actually in America, many, I don't know many, but people are trafficked and are forced to do prostitution. And it's hard to find this out. So he's built a system that allows to go through the web, extract information, and allow those law enforcement to interactively explore these. It's ranked by different, by the likelihood that something is a fraudulent post somewhere on Craigslist, compares all the telephone numbers, and allows them this law enforcement to go after these people. He got the MacArthur Genius Award recently, and this whole project has led to many PhD theses. He's computer science in Stanford, who worked on many small problems in this stuff, but overall, it delivered a system that works. Maybe, and has solved some problems.
I think Katja would like a reaction to this, potentially?
No.
More.
No. No, sorry. I just. First of all, I love the many different examples you bring, and we discussed before that we would try to show you like the landscape of where big data, where and what it influences in our life. I just wanted to make sure we have enough examples for later. The one thing I think we will have fun in the discussion after Maria has done her introduction is that I don't think by just using more of the big, you said you just have to use the right data. I completely agree with it. But to identify which and what is the right questions to ask and the right data, this is where it comes. You do not just more of the same. You actually need to look at it. And this is absolutely crucial in so many ways, and we have examples for it where we and scientists have done everything right, like with the new energy-saving light bulbs. You know what actually happens? People use more freaking energy in their houses because the light is blue, the temperature in the room is still the same, you actually see better in the room, but as the light is blue, people still feel colder, so they turn off their heating, and you're using more energy while you're using energy-saving bulbs. So the thing is, you get more and more data to know it, but you also have to look at it, and we as researchers always define the boundaries of our research, and we have to go beyond that. Sorry.
So luckily we also have now light bulbs, LED bulbs, who have reduced the energy consumption for light by 90%. And they also come in different colors, not just blue. So the other thing is, what does it take? And I completely agree, and this is something that also Anne mentioned in her talk. We need something, we need to understand the basics of data science, and that's mathematics. That's statistics. Statistics is the science of how do you analyze, collect data, interpret data, and draw the right conclusions. Yeah? So one of the things, for example, 2 examples is, if you poll people in London, who will there be a Brexit or not? You will get many people who say, no, of course not. But is this an unbiased sample? You learn 101 in statistics. If you want to sample something, you have an unbiased sample, stratified sampling. If you sample, the same as this here, let's say you work somewhere in a developed country, and you only sample the data from people who don't represent everybody, because they're the richer people, you are violating the basic rules of statistics 101. So this means one of the important things, what I think is required, is people who understand data science, mathematics. Science is about how to apply mathematics. And this brings me to the perils of big data. The first one is stats. And that's exactly also what Anne said. All the rules that you have learned for small amounts of data apply also for big data, even more. And there's something else in addition to the normal rules of statistics. So it turns out that that's counterintuitive, but that's just something also called the curse of dimensionality. If you get more and more data, very often also the dimensionality of the data increases. So you have more and more entries, but also you have now more different features, attributes. What is the gender of the people? What is their eye color? When do they wake up? What is their dress, what they have on? And if you now have more and more data, it turns out that you need exponentially more data in order for a linear increase in the number of attributes to have statistically significant answers. If you just boil the ocean, I always get people to me say, hey, we have this data set, let's do something, we can find something. If you boil the ocean, you will find all kinds of different conclusions, correlations, which are not causations. So this means these kind of rules will even apply more if you have big data. So stats is very essential. The second thing about...
I think let's table one... Yeah, let's
I think
step aside for a second and table one aspect I think that we want to go back to again is the various relation between the technical and the social knowledge that we need in that. And I think it's also, it will be interesting for us to turn on the one hand to all the various aspects through which the technical decisions influence such things, and that we need the technical know-how for that, but also how those technical conditions are situated again in a cultural environment, and how people actually make those decisions, I think. And I think that's a little bit of what Maria might touch on, but I'm speculating.
Okay, I'm so happy I get to do the introductory statement before the panel is over. Thank you. Actually, so I'm Maria Binz-Scharf. I would like to thank the Austrian taxpayers for this lavish affair. It's really beautiful, and I love this panel. We've had conversations before in preparation, as Christoph mentioned, and Clemens Mantel and Simone Poce did a fantastic job of putting together people who will, you know, engage in a lively conversation because we agree on some things, but we disagree on others. Let me start by saying that I'm probably the odd one out here. I call myself a small data girl in a big data world. That's my tagline, thank you. I'm getting the tattoo. So what I do is I observe people at work, which means, so people in computational fields ask me, what does that mean? I mean, how do you get your data? Well, I go and I watch and I observe and I take notes. That's my data. And I interview people. That's my data, right? The interview transcripts become data. Now, when I talk to computer scientists in particular, machine learning experts, they're saying, well, luckily, that will be a thing of the past because we all have sensors, we can record everything, we can collect big data, bring that all together, and make sense of it without you. Right, so, and this is not just a pitch for the reason of the existence of ethnographers in the future, but I do argue that small data, such as the ones that I collect, have incredible potential to not only explain big data that give you the big picture, but to make sure that you think not only on how to have the best algorithm, but what of the sense making, why? What are the social scientific implications underlying everything we're talking about? I'll give you an example. I was at a wonderful conference organized by UCLA, the Institute of Pure and Applied Mathematics. They invited me to give a talk there. I was among machine learning experts and computer scientists, and they presented their crazy algorithms and so on. But so there was this one mathematician, I'm not going to name his name because it doesn't matter, who had an incredible, we talked about Tinder before, right? So he had an incredible wealth of data on, I believe it's called eHarmony. I'm sorry, I've been married for 13 years, so but before I got married, we didn't have those things. So I'm not practical with dating websites, but what I know is when you do register for a dating website and you get active, you disclose a lot of information on yourself, because you ideally would like to have somebody who matches your preferences, right? So, or you disclose whatever you think is useful. So he goes to do this mind-blowing, dynamic presentation of billions of data points showing how women in suburbs have different ways of screening potential mates from inner city women and so on. And so I listened to all of this and said, well, the differences, for example, of dating patterns in San Francisco and in Atlanta, or in Sydney and whatever. So you get it, right? And I'm sitting there and I'm starting to ask, why is that? So why do you think that is? And he, quite honestly, this is all recorded. You can watch it. The videos are online. He said, well, I don't know. I just have the data, and I thought it would be a cool thing to do, you know, to just make these comparisons. But to his defense, he works with a sociologist who's helping him with the social theories, right? Why would a suburban woman have a different way of approaching mates from an inner city woman, right? We can make our inferences. But, so the important thing is, before we start any analysis of big data, and you heard Wolfgang say that the same things that we learned about research methods for small data apply to big data, we have to first have a theoretical model. So we have to bring in the social sciences. Now, what can my small data do for this big data understanding? So just to continue in my explanation of my career suicide that I've been committing, I've done interdisciplinary research from day one. Not cool. I mean, it is officially cool, but it's not cool for the promotion and purposes. I'll explain that in a second. And I've always wanted to, so I've myself gone back and forth between quantitative and qualitative things. So I want to say that I understand both, but I very early on understood that in order to make sense of complexity and big systems, we need to work together. Nobody can do it alone. Nobody can understand complex systems by themselves. And that doesn't just mean methodologically, but it means by approaches. And quite frankly, the situation that we have in this country and also in my home country, politically, to me, is due to a wrong emphasis on what is important in life. So if we do not understand the basic humanities, we will not be able to make very good mathematicians. That's what I'm saying. So if we do not have an understanding of the small data, the micro context of what people do and why, and what culture, right? Culture is one of the things. Psychology is another of the things. Sociology, very important. Political science. Politics is, you might not know this, but politics is really, really big in networks. So I usually say I'm Austrian, I don't have a sense of humor, but that doesn't work in this crowd, so moving on. So what I'm trying to say is that this career suicide brought me to study social networks as an ethnographer. We have one of the biggest sociologists in the room here today who I want to say who popularized social network analysis. It's Barry Wellman from the University of Toronto. Barry, would you please stand up and just show yourself? I'm a big fan of yours. A big fan of yours. And thank you so much for coming. And Barry is actually somebody who embraced what I suggested to do. Barry wrote a piece in Science when we were, I mean, my generation was in diapers, called Computer Networks as Social Networks, the fact that you connect folks through technology and they start talking. He actually did ethnographic and social network analysis work in Canada. It's in Toronto, right? That you did the community study. Unbelievable, showing how when you connect folks, when you connect folks technologically, they connect sociologically as well. All right, so, but the thing is, I started looking at how people develop their networks. So from the individual point of view, I think it's something we all can relate to. When you think about how you do work, it mostly involves somebody else, especially if we work, we are the so-called knowledge workers, right? Which sometimes is an oxymoron. So we think, we try to solve a problem, and then we access the knowledge of others to solve that problem. Whether we do that directly by talking or by reading up on another's opinion, right? And that's what I call the relational practice perspective. It's the practice that involves somebody else in doing my work. And when you look at work from a relational practice perspective, you realize that the practices absolutely determine our networks. So big data people, the computational social sciences, they can tell me everything I need to know about structures, right? This is, I can tell you through mobile phone, for example, studies, they did enormous studies of all the phone calls that had ever been done in Great Britain, for example. And so they can tell you who is connected to whom through a phone call. Nowadays, Wolfgang will tell you they can do sentiment analysis and add inferences on what is happening in these connections. But why do people connect to one another? When you go beyond records like kinship or geographic proximity, so being close to one another, we don't know. That's why we have to actually do the hard work of watching folks, observing them. And in my blog post that I'm basically now repeating, I mentioned this thing that we are not there yet, but I'm pretty sure we will be. We will know more about why people are doing things because we will just have more longitudinal data on relational practices. But there is so much going on, and let me just give you one example, and then I will pass it on. I've been studying scientists. The scientists are my lab rats. For a number of years, I would sit in the lab and be in the way where somebody is trying to go to the radioactive hood, or you know, be in the way while they're trying to go to the dark room, and ask all these sorts of questions. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And who are you talking to now? And what's a Facebook for biologists? And those kind of things. So I did all my observations, and then I learned about a conference that these people from a specific field all go to. And the good thing for me, bad thing for the data people, was that the programs, the conference programs of this conference were not digitalized, and they were only given to registered participants. Which means, yay, I have an advantage. I can actually scan those in and have an army of research assistants translate that into an access database. And what they had in there was who chaired the various sessions, who organized it, who authored papers, who authored posters, who co-authored, and over the years. So we had these 16 years of data in which, with the help of somebody who actually knows how to do the big data analysis, created this network, starting with the 4,500 people who had been involved in that particular conference. But of course, if you look at all these connections to them, it quickly grew into millions of data points. And we had the evolution. And so we saw, I have these beautiful pictures where you can see how over the years connections among co-authors become more international. The field grows and includes, so first of all, it was only molecular biology, then it includes organic chemistry and bioengineering, and then you move on, and then you have people from medicine and other disciplines. You can see all these things. We also looked at university rankings, and do people from Ivy League universities collaborate with the lesser knowns and so on, right? You can, this stuff, you can all do this. Okay. So we come up with these networks, and we see, you can tell these people have co-authored, so they have shared knowledge, they have created science together. Great. But then you look at the same people. Of course, I couldn't do an ethnography of all 4,500, but I did an ethnography in 3 labs together with my colleague Leslie Paik, who is a sociologist. And so we discover this one pair of connections that is supposed to have a weak tie, which means not very much going on between these two. They co-authored 2 papers, right? One in the 90s and one in 2010. You would say that's not a significant collaboration. But by talking to them, we learn they were postdocs together in the same lab. That's when they authored the first paper. Then they talked for almost a decade about their work, co-developed it, until they were ready, actually almost 2 decades later, to then find something that was really working and publish the next paper. So one would argue that the way they created knowledge, scientific knowledge, is much more significant than somebody who gives you an engineered mouse and is on the paper as a co-author. So that's just my exemplification of showing how knowing context and knowing practices is very, very important to understand the big data, big picture. Thank you.
So considering that we're at about half already, I think, it's high time. I was wondering, could we change the lighting just a little bit so we can actually see you two? That would be lovely. Because we're really interested to hear from you and to see if you have things you would like to add to this, questions you want to pose, or if you disagree very strong, especially if you disagree very strongly, that would be great. And if I can just ask you to very shortly state your name and affiliation so we can interact.
Thank you.
So my name is Horst Bischoff. I'm from Graz University of Technology. So I have one question for Anne and one comment to make on big data. So the question for Anne would be, I completely buy all your arguments, just nice. But there is one thing. People earn a lot of money with having freedom for data. How do you would prevent that? My comment to the big data field, so people are sort of, we have all these deep learning things and that these are great tools. My view on that is, if you look really what they are doing, they are just clever indexing mechanisms which give you basically nearest neighbor search and a little bit of interpolation. They are not mystified machines. And in fact, the reason why they work so good is because we have now the data and then nearest neighbor works. But they don't give you new information in the sense of producing some genuinely new, but they're looking for nearest neighbor samples and do interpolation. So my argument is this is nothing really sort of mystique, and we should really look at the math to do these things correctly, but the question would be for Anne. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me see. Thank you very much for that question. And you're absolutely right at the beginning. It's always this way at the beginning, and I always call it the Wild West phase. Everyone's making a lot of money, they're using all the data, they're going here and there, same with IoT. But it's short-lived. And what I always say is, if you are dealing with personal information and you are not using the protections you should be using in the use of the data, it will come back to bite you. Privacy is becoming extremely important, especially ever since Edward Snowden's revelations 3 years ago. The data breaches and privacy infractions that always result when you don't put the protections in cost companies enormously. They don't just cost in terms of monetary value, they cost in terms of reputation and loss of confidence, loss of trust, loss of customers. So it's not just the case that it's making a lot of money, which it may at the beginning, but it comes back to bite you in a much bigger way. So look at all of the things that are happening with IoT now. IoT, huge, everybody's into it, and the costs are just beginning to become staggering because people are now going into class action lawsuits. You've got the DDoS attack today, that's going to have huge ramifications. People want their information and they want to protect it. And so the messaging to companies who seem to buy my message is if they embed privacy into the design of what they're doing, they can still reap the benefits, but they can also get a greater benefit in terms of gaining a competitive advantage, getting their customers to trust them, and gaining on that and attracting new opportunity, attracting new customers. When you think of, and it's not just in terms of IoT, so think of machine learning. Everybody's in machine learning, artificial intelligence, this is the new wave, isn't this fabulous? And it's all, they present it as if it's just objective without any human intervention, which is nonsense. Humans code the machine learning code. And so now what you're getting a lot of papers coming out and criticism of the machine learning techniques and AI. The term tyranny of algorithms is coming out. In the United States, the FTC has been looking at this very strongly, that they're saying there's a lot of bias that's been introduced by these algorithms against certain socioeconomic groups, etc. So the notion that algorithms and machine learning and AI is just somehow objective and it's science and, you know, don't touch it is crazy. You have to embed protections into these techniques. That's why a lot of the work that I do increasingly is with engineers and computer scientists. We need to be speaking the same language. And when I speak to startups, for example, there's Web 2.0 conference in San Francisco. I spoke there a couple of years ago. And there's like 900 startups you're talking to. And I just very quickly talked about privacy by design, as I did to you, but very quickly, and just said, please consider embedding this into what you're doing. I had people lined up afterwards, 20, 30 guys, they were generally guys, lined up saying, how do we do this? Nobody told us about this. Nobody put it on our radar. So it's not so much that engineers and scientists don't want to do this. You've got to bridge the gap and talk to them as well. And business gets the value of this. So I'm actually very optimistic. I think the real money is going to be in doing it properly and embedding privacy and security into design.
I actually forgot to show you this book, Weapons of Math Destruction by Katja O'Neill. I highly recommend it, which exactly fortifies the point that you were making. Through biased algorithms, we can actually increase inequality. So it's important to have an interdisciplinary team of stakeholders and researchers look at big data analysis.
Great point. If I can just add one more thing, sorry, just really fast. We did a paper called Research Ethics by Design. So in universities, academics, et cetera, you've got REBs that look at research and authorize the use of personal information, et cetera. But often they do it, in my view, in a way which is very much at the end of the line when the research proposal is already advanced and configured, then it goes to the REB. We suggested that the REB process should begin at the beginning of the design of the formulation. And I did my graduate work at U of T. I work with a lot of professors at U of T to try to get this messaging out, both in terms of REBs and design of studies. Thank you.
So I was thinking this comment. I think the comment makes a question about the difference between the science behind deep networks and the efficiency. So the science is also a problem for us. Why? Because all the students now coming and saying, hey, we want to do deep networks. We do all these cool principle things, but no, we want to do deep networks. Why? Because they know if they're finished, they get hundreds of thousands. Why? For the second reason. This stuff solves problems that the other methods have not been able to solve. So if you look at the history of speech translations, we see better error rates, and then there's a sharp drop. So this means, yes, we don't know what's going on, and it's like big, deep stuff. So, and we're waiting for somebody who comes and simplifies this model so that we can actually understand these ones. But these things are now solving these things. That example of Go. So that's these two different things about this. Okay, thank you.
I think there was another question. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Markus Reisenleitner. My official title is Professor of Humanities. I work at the intersection of digital humanities and urban humanities. So obviously, especially what Katja said, but what I heard generally on the panel, I'm very sympathetic to. My concern is, where are these blockages to actually get humanists and artists on the table and involved in these discussions? I know, especially in terms of what Katja was presenting, I teach this at those walking in the city to my first year undergraduates, right? So there is a lot of expertise from humanists, from people who work on urban cultures that I think could be communicated and could make a difference in the planning of these systems. I do have the feeling, because this has been called for 20 years at least, that's as long as I've been in the academy, and not really much has happened. And my suspicion is that we might not be able to answer the questions that you have, and you might have the wrong questions. I often feel you would like us to say, people in Vietnam use scooters and not cars. The Vietnamese culture is different because. But of course, culture is not a simple phenomenon. Culture is something very complex, and I think anthropologists, historians, sociologists are pretty good at identifying the complexities and saying, well, we can't talk about culture in Vietnam. We have to unpack this. It's much more complicated. Various groups, depends on social class, things change. And these are not exactly what you would like humanists to tell you. I also think that in terms of big data and algorithms, and this might be a little counterintuitive, but humanities scholars have actually learned to distrust the predictability of histories. That's precisely what algorithms do. They look at histories, extrapolate, have mathematical models. Historians, anthropologists have learned to believe in unpredictability and subversity, in studying why somebody might not take the most efficient route because another route maybe invokes some memories, has place names attached to it, has family histories attached to it. Those are all things that maybe are very difficult to model. Maybe they are impossible to model by algorithms. So I think that there are still some communicative issues that prevent this, oh, let's just ask the humanities scholars how this works, to really be able to contribute a lot. And that's why I would actually like this theoretical level of discussion to go further and to be really more than just asking the little questions that could make a difference in the traffic flow of Vietnam, but sort of look at the two cultures, the two solitudes that make it so difficult to communicate. And I think half of the problem is, of course, the humanities problem.
Should we start your answer? Maybe Katja can go, and then, yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, just quick. Yes, both is true, but we need a respect in both directions. We need people from the humanities, people from the arts, not to just see data scientists as their nerdy workhorse doing the dirty work who's never get mentioned. And we need to understand that the data scientists not only tag on this like one person from cultural studies to understand one thing. Okay, yes, and yes, we need to be clear that we need funding for that and we need to give out money for that. I agree on this. But we also have to be respectful in both ways. Like, actually, we're doing a lot of routing in transportation traffic along points of interest or ways that people, so my first work was in wayfinding and crowd dynamics. So we are actually looking a lot in it. And the people who do that benefit. The people who do an interdisciplinary work benefit a lot of it, especially if you find a common language. However, and I think that's where I head off to Maria, you benefit more in the real world than in your career as a scientist from it. So I was only hired at the Asian development because I could bridge those questions between actual urban planning and technology, between actually what different cultures want and how we can use technology for that. And that's why the Rockefeller hired me too now, to look globally at cities and look what's the differences and stuff. We have to find a common language, but we have to be respectful from both sides. And this is something that we both, on both sides currently, are not.
So you're handing over to say why we can't talk to one another. Why don't we have a common language? Yeah, and thank you for putting that in there. I totally agree that we do need to learn to talk to one another. But have you ever tried to interest somebody who has studied mostly Shakespeare or, I don't know, just in digital anything? They will faint or start to sweat profusely or run away screaming because it's not my, you know, please don't say this to me. I'm exaggerating, but it is true that we have gotten into this situation where we are all each so specialized in probably a very, very important thing, but it's so tiny, and there's a huge moat around it of ignorance about everything else. And we also do not have the confidence, because of this lack of general knowledge, to even be open to accept a completely different perspective. So I think that is, we don't all need to learn what Wolfgang is fantastic at doing, like algorithms, but you have to learn to speak rudimentary, you have to develop a rudimentary understanding so that you can have a conversation. And value the contribution of somebody who does not do what you do. So what does it mean in the academy if, as a young scholar, I called it career suicide, right? If as a young scholar you decide that you want to work interdisciplinarily. I mean, I entered into this interdisciplinarily. Most potential employers will say, I don't know how to I don't know in which box to put you in, so you know, that's a hot potato, let's not touch it. But you find more and more places that have this interdisciplinary mindset, because if you're truly, and sometimes it helps if you have tenure, it helps if you actually are a full professor or even distinguished, right? So you're really high up, you have nothing to lose, and that's when you suddenly realize we need to actually change the way we're doing things. Because the way academia is running now, we write things for a few people to understand, and if they don't understand it and they don't have the intellectual generosity to give it the benefit of the doubt, it will not see the light of the day. And in the work that I do, that is, I mean, I don't want to brag, but it takes a lot of time. Not brag, complain. I don't mean to complain. I love doing that, but it takes a lot of time to go through this stuff. And I somehow was able to get tenure, so I have that job security. And from that day, I refused to do incremental BS. Excuse my language. I'm done with it. I do not want to write for the 3 people I don't know, because they're anonymous, who will decide on my fate. I'm done with this. There must be another way. And so people are thinking about altmetrics. They're thinking about, what are you contributing actually? Have you created a database that others can use? That should be part of your promotional package. So we're getting there. But right now, yes, the National Science Foundation tells you, find a social scientist on your grant, physics people. And I get these calls, like, hey Maria, you do the human thing. Can you be on my grant? I mean, they have no idea what I do. They need a social scientist. That's not a collaboration. That's not collaborative knowledge creation. So you have to start these conversations. The conference I mentioned before, and I will hand it back to you, IPAM, is sponsored by the National Science Foundation. It is this intent of getting together a group of interdisciplinary folks to talk high level about things that involve math, but don't scare anybody, right? And are also comprehensible. And those efforts start to build bridges. Sorry.
Can I also respond?
We have a question waiting.
I think this is relevant. So the first thing is, there is a common language, and that's math. Everything that has to do with science is basic on math, and we need people to understand a basic language, science, and statistics. The second thing is this about, so you said like sometimes people just go into one track and don't see something else. There's a fundamental trait of machine learning. It's called explore and exploit. But you see sometimes Google is not routing you the fastest route because they want to see exploit some alternative route. Because there's a trade-off. Sometimes you have a little bit incremental, but you learn something new. Third thing about interdisciplinary discussion. I like this word because, Anne, you used this before. Interdisciplinary discussion is awesome, it is great. Yeah? You have people coming together, smart people of all kinds of different disciplines, and you exchange your ideas for two reasons. The first reason is you learn something from a different field, you hear some ideas. And very often we use in different areas analogical reasoning. Yesterday I took a couple of things away, like politics, the difficulty that France had 24 different political things, chemistry, water bounds, a number of different things, and even the philosophy of AI. It's also good for you because you learn to communicate your own points. If you communicate something and I say, I don't understand, you realize, oh, there's somebody who doesn't speak your language, you adopt something. So interdisciplinary discourse is very essential and fruitful. We need to have this.
And
interdisciplinary work, I think it is overrated. So in the way that we talk about interdisciplinary work, when I have seen that collaborations that work, that usually work because you have some group who works on something and they need somebody else who complements them. But coming together and saying, we want to solve the problem of the future of self-driving cars. So let's put a couple of engineers who build on this and other people who study the effect, the culture of self-driving cars. Is this really what we need? Yeah? So therefore, discussion is very important. But when we talk about the idea of interdisciplinary work, do we have data that shows that if you run a bunch of people, we put artists on big data projects, that they actually work better? Do we have the data? Or is this some ideology that we are following?
I do need to do one thing here. When you said explore and exploit, that's actually a concept by Joseph Schumpeter, who is not a computer scientist.
We'll have a 60
He's an
seconds
economist
rule from
and he was
now.
awesome in math.
Please, audience.
Well, I don't want to interrupt. My question actually follows up on what you've been just talking about, and the previous question preempted some of my interests. My name is Thomas Schmidt, University of Oregon. I'm in media studies and journalism studies. And it's very encouraging to hear this kind of emphasis on working together in terms of the technology and the humanities. But you touched on some of the challenges already, and maybe you could expand on that a little bit if you think about the perspective of a young and emerging scholar, how to navigate that academic reality where interdisciplinary work is encouraged, but not necessarily we don't necessarily have a good career track with that. So how do you navigate that field where, in terms of the vocabulary, everyone wants that kind of bridging between disciplines and everyone wants that crossing the boundaries, but in fact, when it comes down to actual grants and research projects and also just finding collaborators, you see these kind of difference in culture. So do you maybe have some examples how you that worked out in your personal field?
I think this is a wonderful question also for us to take exactly 60 seconds each, and then we're exactly at 11:30. That's perfect. Actually, we just have 4 minutes, so I'll keep mine to 20 seconds. I think it's very hard. There are some fields, and so I'm before tenure, I'm I think in many ways very lucky because I'm at this very interdisciplinary place. And even at this place that is so extremely interdisciplinary, we struggle every month with understanding each other's work. And it takes a lot of time, but it's also just extremely rewarding. One issue with that is simply time scale. As Maria also mentioned, it takes a lot of time to do this, and it takes longer. And it's very hard then to make the case, but essentially for what you have to do is tell a compelling story about how your work is relevant, and you have to explain to each of the other disciplines what your role is in the other disciplines that you're also involved in that they don't know, and how it is relevant and how it is important. And unfortunately, of course, that's not a very, very satisfying response, I think. Maybe those here who already have tenure can shed more light on that.
First, find somewhere where you're welcome. There is more places like the Media Lab out there that looks for anti-disciplinary, not only for interdisciplinary work. And the second is, don't be shy to talk to the public. Mm-hmm. I have suffered greatly by actually interacting with journalists and then people coming back to me and said, oh, you didn't really fill in everything. A journalist is not going to write every 15 caveats into it, but nevertheless do it, because then some people out there that are not in your field might read this article or interview about you and actually invite you to come. So there is it out there, and I've seen it in Austrian research funding too. And this I was super surprised too. So there is money, there is opportunity, and don't be shy about it.
So interdisciplinary discussion, awesome, great opportunities, discuss your work, talk to other people, it shapes your own thinking. You learn from other disciplines, very good, very good. But interdisciplinary work, it often works, in my experience, if you find skills that fit. You have a problem, you need somebody else. And I also thought it's either like somebody in chemistry needs somebody in maths. So Martin Nowak, for example, is an example of very awesome. He comes from maths and he solves real problems. I forgot. So it's an example. But this idea, this notion of top-down, let's create together and create something. What is needed? It's skills, and I'm very sure about this. What we need also, because I always think here some decision makers, going back to Austria, what we need more people who understand math in a couple of years, because if you don't understand the language of science that underlines all of these things and on top of other things, then you just can't understand. You can't understand, yeah? It's just impossible for you to access this. So I think more math.
Okay, I've said my opinion, but I do want to touch on the recommendation here. Find people who are like Barry Wellman, people who have the intellectual generosity to accept a different approach. Absolutely what Katja said. It needs to be a place that where you feel welcome. My book project on the future of work, which is actually more like the way we are working now, because I'm not a futurist, wants to argue that it's not about you having to fit into any place and having to please your 3 anonymous reviewers, and especially reviewer number 2, but it is about your goals and your purpose in life, right? We finally at this tipping point in history where people, millennials, are talking about work-life balance. Whoop. So it's an important thing, right? So what is your purpose? What is your goal? And then you use organizations and institutions, you thread in and out of them as you need them to accomplish your career. The network perspective is what counts. And finally, if you don't get tenure at one place, you'll get tenure somewhere else. So just if you put all your eggs in one basket, you think that that's what makes or breaks you, that's the wrong goal, in my opinion. But it's easy for me to say. So thank you.
I would point to the shortcomings of taking a strictly single disciplinary approach. I would point to the example I gave in terms of data scientists who were themselves saying, oh my God, we're really worried about the privacy implications of this. And 88% of them saying, we have to do something. We have to find some privacy solutions. We don't know what they are. Of course they don't know what they are because it's not their field. But if you do interdisciplinary, you get rid of the silos, you talk to people. I talk to data scientists all the time. I talk to engineers. And you can point out in your research that your research will benefit from that interdisciplinary approach because it will not be criticized afterwards. All the articles that are coming out now criticizing machine learning, AI, the tyranny of algorithms. The last thing you want as a data scientist is to have things like that coming out about the research that you do, which you've probably done very properly, but it's far too narrow. So you can point to them that taking the interdisciplinary approach will yield not only better research, but research that will be accepted on a far broader way, both publicly and that will generate additional funding in terms of research grants.
Excellent, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of the panel members and the audience. And I think we're exactly on time to continue this discussion. There is no break. Is there a break now?
Wow, this was hardcore, at least for me. Thank you very much for all your passion in this discussion. Before we move on, if you want to read more about all the interventions today, we printed out the contributions of the panelists to our Bridges blog on austria.com. It's at the reception desk, just take it with you. And thanks again for this passion, because this shows me why I love this job. I'm a career diplomat. I've been in the diplomatic crowd. I've been in concentrating on culture. I've been in the artistic crowd, but nothing compares to that. And all the passion, and it shows why exactly your knowledge and your passion makes this the era of the nerds, how I put it, and I'm proud and I'm happy to be part of it. And it was from digital, very analog discussion, And talking about that, the most important algorithms I learned are cooking recipes. So we move on to the food and from big data to big coffee, and we'll be back here at 12 sharp. Thank you.